German pilots were shocked when American gunners hit targets blindfolded. January 17, 1944. 35,000 feet above the frost-covered fields of Bavaria, the air was thin enough to freeze a man's breath inside his oxygen mask. The sky stretched pale and infinite, a canvas of ice-blue emptiness broken only by the silver glint of aluminum wings catching the morning sun. Inside the cramped ball turret of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski felt the hydraulic hum of machinery vibrating through his gloves as he tracked a lone Messerschmitt Bf-109 climbing hard through the contrails below. The German fighter pilot, likely a veteran, judging by the precision of his approach, was ascending at an angle calculated to exploit the bomber's blind spot. But Kowalski wasn't watching the plane. His eyes were locked onto a small circular screen no larger than a dinner plate, glowing faintly green in the shadows of his turret. On that screen, a blip of light danced and pulsed, representing the enemy fighter in electromagnetic form. Kowalski's hands moved across the turret controls with the fluidity of a pianist, his twin. 50 caliber machine guns swiveling smoothly to meet a target he had never seen with his naked eyes. When he pressed the firing button, the guns roared, their recoil shaking the turret like a steel drum. 12 seconds later, the Messerschmitt broke apart in midair, its wings folding backward as smoke poured from the engine cowling. The German pilot never knew what hit him. To him, the American gunner had fired blind and struck true. This was not magic. This was not luck. This was the birth of a revolution in aerial warfare that German aviators, trained in the old doctrines of visual combat and individual prowess, could scarcely comprehend. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had ruled European skies with an almost mythic confidence, their pilots legends of skill and daring, their aircraft engineered for speed and agility. They had flown against the British, the Soviets, the French, and they had learned to read the sky like an ancient text, anticipating enemy movements through instinct, experience, and the raw physics of dogfighting. But when American bombers began arriving over occupied Europe in 1943, escorted by fighters and defended by gunners wielding weapons guided by something invisible, something beyond human sight, the German pilots encountered a phenomenon that shattered their understanding of air combat. They called it Geisterschützen ghost gunners, men who seemed to fire through clouds, through darkness, through the very walls of their own aircraft and still find their mark. The Americans called it radar-directed fire control, and it represented the culmination of mobilization so vast, so technologically advanced, that it rendered obsolete centuries of military tradition in a matter of months. The story of how American gunners came to hit targets they could not see begins not in the skies over Germany, but in the laboratories and proving grounds of a nation that had entered the war late, but arrived with resources that defied comprehension. While Europe had been bleeding since 1939, the United States had been building not just tanks and ships and aircraft, but systems, integrated networks of technology, training, and mass production that transformed warfare from an art into a science. The Germans had always prided themselves on their engineering, their precision, their disciplined approach to military innovation. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Junkers, these names carried weight, represented excellence. But German innovation, for all its brilliance, was constrained by the realities of a wartime economy stretched across multiple fronts, by ideological interference from a regime that distrusted pure science, and by a strategic doctrine that still romanticized the individual warrior over the collective system. The Americans, by contrast, had no such constraints. They had space, resources, time, and a pragmatic willingness to throw money and manpower at problems until those problems ceased to exist. Radar, the technology that would revolutionize air defense and offensive gunnery, had been developed independently by several nations before the war. The British had pioneered its use in their chain-home early warning system, which helped them survive the Battle of Britain. The Germans had their own radar systems, employed primarily for ground-based air defense and naval applications. But the Americans took radar and did what they did best. They miniaturized it, mass-produced it, and integrated it into offensive weapons systems at a scale no other nation could match. By 1943, American bombers were being equipped with tail-mounted radar units that could detect approaching fighters from miles away, feeding targeting data directly to gunners who no longer needed to rely solely on their eyes. The Germans, accustomed to using cloud cover, sun glare, and high-speed approaches to evade defensive fire, suddenly found themselves being tracked and engaged by gunners who seemed to possess supernatural awareness. A Messerschmitt diving out of the sun, an attack run that had worked flawlessly against British bombers just months earlier, would be met with a storm of .50 caliber rounds fired with uncanny accuracy, the tracers arcing through the air like the fingers of an invisible hand reaching out to crush the attacker. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and immediate. Veteran aces, men who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front and over the English Channel, began reporting encounters that defied their training and experience. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe pilot credited with 28 kills, would later describe his first engagement with an American bomber formation, equipped with radar-assisted gunnery, as fighting an enemy who could see in all directions at once, who anticipated every move before you made it. Another pilot, whose diary was recovered after the war, wrote in January 1944, "We approach from below, using the clouds as we have always done. But before we are even in firing range, the American guns swivel toward us, not toward where we are, but toward where we will be. It is as if they are reading our minds. 3 of our squadron were shot down today without firing a single round. We did everything correctly. It made no difference." This sense of helplessness, of technical inferiority, was corrosive to morale. The Luftwaffe had built its identity on the superiority of its pilots, on the narrative that German aviators were the finest in the world, heirs to the aces of the First World War. To be outmatched not by better pilots, but by better machines, by systems that rendered pilot skill almost irrelevant, was a blow to the collective ego of the German Air Force that many could not reconcile. But the shock ran deeper than mere technology. What truly staggered German pilots was the realization that this technological advantage was not limited to a few elite units or experimental aircraft. It was everywhere. American bombers arriving over Germany in 1944 weren't rarities. They came in formations of hundreds, each one equipped with radar, each one defended by gunners trained on sophisticated simulators back in the United States. The German war machine, for all its early successes, had never achieved this kind of standardized, mass-produced excellence. Luftwaffe units were chronically undersupplied, their aircraft often patched together from salvaged parts, their pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs as experienced instructors were killed faster than they could be replaced. Meanwhile, American gunners arrived in Europe after months of training on equipment that replicated combat conditions with startling accuracy. They had practiced on moving targets, on targets obscured by simulated weather, on targets detected only by radar signature. By the time they flew their first combat mission, they had already shot down dozens of enemy fighters in training. The Germans, by contrast, were sending 19-year-old pilots into combat with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, throwing them against an enemy that had industrial and B-24 bombers, emitted pulses of radio waves that bounced off metal objects, enemy aircraft, and returned to the receiver, where they appeared as blips on a cathode ray tube screen. This data was then relayed to the gunner, either through a direct visual display or through an automated turret system that tracked the target independently of human input. The Sperry Ball turret, perhaps the most iconic and claustrophobic fighting position in the American bomber fleet, was a marvel of mechanical engineering. a spherical assembly of armor plate, machine guns, and hydraulics that rotated on two axes, allowing a single gunner to cover almost the entire lower hemisphere of the aircraft. When coupled with radar targeting data, the ball turret became a weapons system of terrifying efficiency. German pilots quickly learned to fear the belly of American bombers, that armored sphere from which tracers emerged with mechanical precision, tracking their movements with an accuracy that seemed almost prescient. Yet the technology alone was not the secret. What made American aerial gunnery so effective was the integration of that technology into a comprehensive system of training, doctrine, and industrial support. Before a single B-17 ever crossed the Atlantic, thousands of gunners had cycled through training facilities across the United States, where they learned not just to shoot, but to think like systems operators. They studied aircraft recognition until they could identify a Focke-Wulf 190 from a Messerschmitt 109 in a fraction of a second, even at extreme range. They practiced calculating lead and deflection angles, understanding the ballistics of their weapons in thin air at high altitude. They trained on simulators that replicated the stress and disorientation of combat, the noise, the cold, the sensation of being trapped in a tiny metal box while enemy cannon rounds tore through aluminum just feet away. And critically, they trained together, learning to coordinate their fire to call out targets, to function as a single organism rather than isolated individuals. This was not the German model of the lone ace, the knight of the air. This was industrial warfare, and the Americans had perfected it. The symbolic object that came to represent this gulf in capability, this chasm between the old world of aerial combat and the new, was not a radar screen or a gun sight, but something far more mundane: the electric heating element. American bomber crews flew at altitudes where temperatures regularly dropped to 40 and 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Frostbite was a constant threat, as was hypothermia. German pilots, flying in aircraft designed for short, sharp engagements at lower altitudes, knew this cold intimately. It was part of the hardship they endured, part of the warrior's burden. But American bombers were equipped with electrically heated flight suits, heated gloves, heated boots. Gunners stationed in the most exposed positions, the ball turret, the tail turret, could plug themselves into the aircraft's electrical system and remain warm, comfortable, capable of fine motor control even after hours in freezing stratosphere. German pilots, when they learned of this, were incredulous. They flew in leather jackets and wool-lined boots, their hands going numb inside their gloves, their faces masked in ice from their own breath. And here were the Americans, warm and comfortable, shooting them down with machines that did half the work for them. It seemed almost obscene, this abundance, this casual disregard for suffering. It represented something the Germans had not fully understood when they declared war on the United States: the sheer, overwhelming industrial and material capacity of a nation that had barely begun to mobilize its resources. The records of aerial engagements from late 1943 and throughout 1944 tell the story in stark, numerical terms. In the early months of the American daylight bombing campaign, German fighters had enjoyed considerable success, shooting down bombers at rates that made some strategic planners in Washington question the viability of unescorted deep penetration raids. But as American technological advantages accumulated, long-range fighter escorts, improved defensive armament, radar-directed gunnery, better crew training, the attrition rates reversed. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots and aircraft at a pace it could not sustain. On a single day, March 6, 1944, during a raid on Berlin, American gunners claimed over 100 German fighters destroyed, with another 50 probable kills. German records, though incomplete, confirm catastrophic losses. Even accounting for the inevitable overclaiming that occurs in the chaos of air combat, the trend was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was being bled white, not by superior pilots, but by superior systems. German aces continued to rack up impressive kill counts, men like Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn who would end the war with hundreds of victories. But these were outliers, exceptional individuals operating in increasingly desperate circumstances. The majority of German pilots were cannon fodder, rushed into combat against an enemy that had turned aerial warfare into something resembling an assembly line process. Targets identified, tracked, engaged, destroyed, next target. What the Germans expected in those early encounters with American bombers was a fight recognizable within the traditions of air combat that had evolved over 30 years. They expected to use speed, altitude, and tactical surprise to neutralize superior numbers. They expected American gunners to panic under pressure, to fire wildly and waste ammunition. They expected the natural advantages of the defender, fighting over friendly territory, with shorter supply lines, to prevail over time. What they encountered instead was something alien to their experience. An enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources, unlimited replacement aircraft, unlimited trained crews, and a technological edge that widened with every passing to one with gunnery systems so integrated and automated that shooting down a single bomber could cost an entire staffel half its strength. The individual heroism that the Luftwaffe prized, the personal courage and skill of its pilots, became increasingly irrelevant in the face of systematic, industrialized violence. The transformation this wrought in German military thinking was profound, though it came too late to alter the outcome of the war. Captured Luftwaffe officers, interrogated by Allied intelligence after the war, spoke with a mixture of resentment and grudging admiration about American technological superiority. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most distinguished fighter commanders, wrote in his post-war memoirs that the Luftwaffe had been fighting a 19th-century war with 20th-century technology against an enemy, fighting a 20th-century war with 21st-century technology. The hyperbole was understandable. To German pilots trained in the doctrines of close-in dogfighting, where victory went to the pilot with better reflexes, better situational awareness, better nerve, the American approach seemed almost inhuman in its reliance on machines and systems. There was no glory in being shot down by a gunner who never saw you, who was simply following targeting cues on a glowing screen. There was no honor in losing to an enemy who won through sheer material abundance rather than martial virtue. But the Americans had never sought glory in the European sense. They sought efficiency, results, the practical application of industrial power to military problems. This was the legacy of a nation that had been built on mass production, on standardization, on the idea that any problem could be solved with enough resources applied systematically. When Henry Ford revolutionized automobile manufacturing with the assembly line, he created a template that would extend far beyond civilian industry. The B-24 Liberator bomber, one of the most produced aircraft of the war, was manufactured using assembly line techniques at a plant in Willow Run, Michigan, that at its peak was producing one complete bomber every 63 minutes. This was a rate of production that German industry, even operating at maximum capacity, could not approach. And each of those bombers rolled off the line equipped with the latest radar, the most advanced gun sights, the most effective defensive systems American engineers could devise. The Germans could produce individual aircraft of exceptional quality. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, but they could not produce them in quantities sufficient to matter. Quality in this war had been buried under an avalanche of quantity backed by systematic quality control. The sound that came to haunt German pilots, the auditory signature of American aerial dominance, was not the roar of engines or the chatter of machine guns, but the steady, rhythmic asterisk ping of radar pulses. Those who survived encounters with American bombers and lived to describe them often mentioned this sound, or rather, The knowledge of this sound, the awareness that somewhere in the enemy formation, invisible radio waves were sweeping through space, illuminating them, marking them as targets. It was the sound of being seen when you thought you were hidden, of being known when you believed yourself safe. And it was a sound that represented the fundamental shift in warfare that radar technology embodied. The end of hiding, the collapse of distance as protection, the transformation of the battlefield into a transparent space where information, not courage, was the ultimate weapon. German technology had produced wonders: the first operational jet fighter, the first ballistic missile, innovations in rocketry and aerodynamics that would influence post-war aviation for decades. But these were the achievements of a nation fighting for survival, throwing resources at prestige projects, while its basic industrial infrastructure crumbled under Allied bombing. The Americans, by contrast, had the luxury of systematic development, of testing and refining technologies until they were reliable enough for mass deployment, of discarding approaches that didn't work and doubling down on those that did. By the winter of 1944-1945, the air war over Germany had become a massacre. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel, stripped of experienced pilots, flying aircraft assembled by slave labor in underground factories, was a shadow of the force that had terrorized Europe in 1940. American bomber formations flew almost unmolested, their gunners often completing entire missions without firing a shot, not because there were no German fighters, but because the Germans had learned that attacking these formations was tantamount to suicide. The few attacks that did occur were acts of desperation, young pilots throwing themselves at bomber formations in the hope that ramming might succeed where gunnery had failed. Captured German documents from this period reveal a Luftwaffe in psychological collapse, its commanders writing reports that bordered on the philosophical, questioning whether continued resistance was even meaningful against an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority. One particularly poignant document, a letter from a German fighter squadron commander to his wife, dated February 1945, describes watching a formation of American bombers pass overhead, their contrails drawing perfect white lines across the sky, and feeling not fear, but a kind of awe at the perfection of it, the mathematical precision of their formation. The knowledge that behind each of those aircraft was an industrial system, so vast that our entire war production, this realization that the war had been lost not on the battlefield but in the factory, not through lack of courage but through lack of resources, was perhaps the most bitter pill for German military professionals to swallow. The Nazi regime had promised a new order, a triumph of will and racial superiority over the decadent democracies of the West. What they encountered instead was a democracy that had outproduced them, out-innovated them, and systematically dismantled their military through the application of industrial capitalism operating at total war footing. The American gunner, sitting in his heated turret, tracking targets on a radar screen, represented the antithesis of everything the Nazi military ideology stood for. He was not an individual hero. He was an operator in a system, a component in a machine, and yet in his systematic, trained, technologically enabled competence, he was more lethal than any warrior knight the Germans could field. The epilogue to this story is written not in the skies over Europe, but in the post-war world that emerged from the ashes of the Third Reich. The radar technology that allowed American gunners to hit targets they could not see became the foundation for air traffic control systems that made modern civil aviation possible. The systems integration approach that the American military pioneered, the idea that technology, training, and doctrine must work together as a unified whole, became the template for modern military organizations worldwide. The Germans, in their post-war reckoning, would come to understand that they had not lost to better soldiers, but to a better system, a more adaptable and scalable approach to warfare that leveraged industrial capacity and technological innovation in ways their rigid, ideology-driven military structure could not match. The shock that German pilots felt when they first encountered American gunners hitting targets blindfolded, or seeming to, was the shock of colliding with the future. It was the moment when the old world of martial prowess and individual heroism met the new world of systems and science and found itself wanting. In the end, the story of American radar-directed gunnery is not really about radar at all. It is about abundance, about the advantages that accrue to a nation with continental resources, with a population educated in engineering and science, with an economic system capable of mobilizing those resources toward a single goal. The Germans had been taught to believe that discipline and willpower could overcome material disadvantages, that superior culture and racial purity would prevail over mere numbers. The Americans proved, in the skies over Europe and across every theater of the war, that this was a lie. They proved that freedom, messy, inefficient, democratic freedom, could organize itself for total war more effectively than any authoritarian system. They proved that the factory worker in Detroit, the engineer in Los Angeles, the farmer's son from Iowa trained to operate a radar set, were collectively more powerful than the vaunted German war machine, and they proved it not with speeches or ideology, but with 50 caliber rounds guided by invisible radio waves, fired by men who never saw their targets but hit them nonetheless, because they were part of a system that worked, a system built on science and industry, and the fundamental belief that problems could be solved through ingenuity and effort rather than mysticism and blood. The glowing green screen, the radar blip dancing across its surface, the tracer rounds arcing through sub-zero darkness to find their mark. These are the images that remain, the technological totems of American power in the Second World War. But behind those images lies a deeper truth, one that German pilots learned too late, that in modern warfare, the nation that can harness its industrial and scientific capacity most effectively will prevail, regardless of the individual courage of its warriors. The blindfolded gunners were never really blind. They simply saw with electronic eyes, extensions of a system that had transformed warfare from an art into a science, from a contest of wills into a problem of engineering. And in that transformation, in that systematic application of technology to violence, the Americans had created something that shocked the Germans not because it was incomprehensible, but because it was so comprehensible, so logical, so utterly pragmatic. They had taken the romance out of war and replaced it with efficiency. They had won not by being better warriors, but by being better engineers. And in the frozen skies above Germany, as one after another Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf tumbled burning toward the earth, shot down by gunners who tracked them on glowing screens, that lesson was written in fire and smoke for all who had eyes to see.